Dr. Elena Vasquez had mastered the art of being forgettable. In a research station orbiting Kepler 442b, where egos inflated faster than emergency airlocks deployed, invisibility was a survival skill. While her colleagues postured over xenobiology discoveries and competed for publication credits, Elena sat in Lab 7, hunched over translation matrices that most people assumed were about as exciting as watching paint dry in zero gravity. "Still playing with your alien fairy tales, Vasquez?" Dr. Chen Nakamura paused at her workstation, coffee bulb in hand, wearing that particular expression reserved for people who thought they understood irony but only grasped condescension. Elena didn't look up from her screens. 3 months of intercepted Zephyrian communications scrolled past in elegant flowing script that most linguists dismissed as ceremonial nonsense. They weren't wrong about the ceremonial part. They were catastrophically wrong about the nonsense. "Documenting systematic psychological warfare techniques," she replied, fingers never pausing in their transcription dance. "But fairy tales work too." "Right," Chen snorted, "because the Zephyrians conquered half the spiral arm with bedtime stories." Actually, that was exactly what they'd done. But Elena had learned that truth delivered too directly tended to bounce off academic skulls like cosmic radiation off station shielding. Better to let people discover uncomfortable realities at their own pace, usually right before those realities ate them. The Zephyrian Empire didn't bother with conventional warfare. Messy, expensive, and ultimately unnecessary when you could simply convince an entire species that their worst nightmares were real. Other civilizations sent armies. The Zephyrians sent fear itself, precisely calibrated to each species' psychological weak points. The Altarians, who treasured individual identity, faced shapeshifters that stole faces. The collective-minded cetaceans encountered visions of absolute isolation, simple, elegant, and completely effective. "Have you considered," Elena said, watching a particularly interesting passage about dream seed implantation, "that maybe the reason they're so good at conquering civilizations is because they actually understand how those civilizations think?" "Vasquez, they're space-age primitives who got lucky with some basic psychology tricks." Chen's voice carried that special academic dismissiveness, reserved for theories that threatened to make someone reconsider their worldview. "Once the Defense Corps figures out their gimmick, it'll be over." Elena finally looked up. Chen had the satisfied expression of someone who just explained something obvious to someone slow. It was the same look administrators wore when they assigned her to harmless linguistic analysis instead of anything important. "What makes you think," she asked, "that humans have any special immunity to having their deepest fears turned against them?" "Please," Chen gestured toward the viewport, where Earth hung like a blue marble against the cosmic void. "We're the species that figured out faster than light travel, built a galactic communication network, and established peaceful first contact with 7 different alien civilizations. You think some psychological parlor tricks are going to send us running?" Elena turned back to her screens. Chen's confidence would have been touching if it weren't so dangerous. Humans had indeed accomplished remarkable things, but their crowning achievements in space exploration and diplomacy had emerged from humanity's greatest strength. Their stunning capacity to ignore obvious problems until those problems became someone else's responsibility. The research station buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Xenobiologists argued over classification systems, engineers debated thruster modifications, communications specialists monitored subspace chatter from 17 different systems. None of them had noticed that the Zephyrian transmissions Elena was just cataloging had been getting stronger, more focused, and increasingly centered on one specific target. "Dr. Vasquez?" The voice belonged to Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Communications. "Those linguistic patterns you've been tracking, We're getting similar transmissions from 7 different vectors, all moving toward Sol system. Elena's fingers stilled over her keyboard. 7 vectors meant 7 fleets. The Zephyrians never deployed multiple fleets unless they expected serious resistance or were planning something particularly elaborate. Time to arrival? 48 hours, assuming they maintain current velocity. Elena nodded, apparently calm. Inside her chest, something that might have been excitement and might have been terror performed an elaborate dance. She'd spent 3 months learning to think like a Zephyrian, to understand the elegant mathematics of species-specific terror. Now she'd discover whether her theories about humanity's psychological defenses were correct, or whether she'd just spent her last few months as a free sentient being, documenting her own species' upcoming enslavement. "Dr. Tanaka," Elena called as the communications officer turned to leave. "Could you patch me into the station's primary broadcast array?" "Sure, but why would you need?" "Research purposes." While Tanaka worked her console magic, Elena opened a different file. Not Zephyrian translations this time, but something far more dangerous. A comprehensive database of human folklore, urban legends and horror stories that she'd been compiling for entirely different reasons than anyone suspected. Chen was right about one thing: humans had achieved remarkable things, but their greatest achievement wasn't technology or diplomacy, it was their unique relationship with fear itself. Every other species Elena had studied tried to eliminate fear, overcome it, or hide from it. Humans had done something else entirely. They'd turned fear into entertainment. The broadcast array came online with a soft chime. Elena's fingers hovered over her keyboard, poised to either save her species or provide the Zephyrians with the most comprehensive guide to human psychological vulnerabilities ever assembled. Either way, things were about to get interesting. The Zephyrian boarding party moved through the station's corridors with the fluid confidence of apex predators who had never encountered anything that could bite back. Commander HFY led the advance team, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the corridor lights into prismatic warnings. They expected screaming, panic, the delicious chaos that preceded surrender. Instead, they found Elena sitting cross-legged in Lab 7, surrounded by floating holographic displays, showing what appeared to be fictional narratives. She looked up from a particularly graphic depiction of something called the Ring, with the mild interest of someone interrupted during lunch. "Commander HFY, I presume?" Elena's voice carried no tremor, no hint of the physiological stress responses that should have been flooding her system. "Your timing is impeccable. I was just reviewing some materials I thought you might find educational." HFY's mandibles clicked in confusion. His species had perfected the science of fear over millennia. Every sentient race exhibited predictable terror patterns when confronted with Zephyrian presence. Elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, fight or flight responses. This human displayed none of them. "You will submit to neural interface," he announced, gesturing to his operatives. "Your species' psychological profile will be extracted and broadcast to your home world. Resistance is meaningless." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of resisting," Elena said, standing and brushing imaginary dust from her lab coat. "In fact, I've been looking forward to this conversation for months. Your people have such a fascinating approach to psychological manipulation." The first operative approached, neural probe extending from its gauntleted hand. Elena held perfectly still as the device made contact with her temple. The Zephyrian's compound eyes widened as data flowed between them. Then something unprecedented happened. The operative stumbled backward, probe retracting, a sound escaping its throat that might have been laughter or might have been horror. "Impossible," HFY hissed. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Elena touched the spot where the probe had been. I simply let your operative experience what humans call Friday night entertainment. Are you familiar with the concept of recreational terror? The commander's exoskeleton darkened, a warning display that had intimidated star systems. Explain. Your species weaponizes fear by identifying what beings find most terrifying and forcing them to experience it. Elena gestured to her holographic displays. Humans do something rather different. We create fear deliberately, voluntarily expose ourselves to it, and actually pay currency for the privilege. She tapped a control, and the displays shifted to show movie theaters packed with humans watching creatures emerge from television screens, zombies devouring flesh, and ancient entities driving mortals to madness. The audience members were screaming, but their biometric readings showed excitement, not genuine terror. This makes no sense, the second operative interjected, its voice carrying electronic harmonics of distress. Fear responses should trigger survival behaviors. Flight, paralysis, submission, not enjoyment. That's where it gets interesting, Elena said, warming to her subject like a professor who'd finally found attentive students. You see, humans have been telling scary stories for thousands of years. We've cultivated fear like other species cultivate crops. We've refined it, perfected it, turned it into art. She pulled up another display showing literature, collections of works by authors who had spent their careers crafting increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological torment, all for human consumption. Your psychological warfare depends on species that experience fear as pure negative stimulus, Elena continued. But humans have developed cognitive frameworks that allow us to experience terror as aesthetic experience. We don't just survive fear, we critique it. HFY's appendages twitched in agitation. Your biological responses indicate deception. The neural probe detected genuine fear patterns. Oh, absolutely, Elena nodded enthusiastically. I'm terrified right now. My heart rate is elevated, my stress hormones are spiking, and part of my brain is screaming at me to run. But here's what your probe couldn't process. Humans have learned to enjoy that feeling. The third operative made a sound like breaking glass. Impossible. No species voluntarily seeks psychological distress. Counterexample, Elena said, pulling up footage of humans jumping from aircraft with fabric wings, scaling vertical rock faces, and deliberately entering enclosed spaces filled with actors dressed as monsters. We call these extreme sports and haunted attractions, multi-billion credit industries built entirely on the principle that humans will pay to be terrified. She could see the psychological impact her words were having. The Zephyrians' confidence was fracturing as they processed information that contradicted their fundamental understanding of sentient behavior. Your species has spent so long being the source of fear, Elena observed, that you've never developed immunity to experiencing it yourselves. You're like viruses that have never encountered an immune system. Commander HFY stepped forward, his presence radiating the psychic pressure that had reduced entire planetary populations to gibbering masses. Elena felt the full weight of Zephyrian psychological warfare pressing against her mind. Visions of death, isolation, cosmic insignificance, the heat death of the universe. She tilted her head thoughtfully. Lovecraft did it better. What? Howard Phillips Lovecraft, human author, early 20th century. Cosmic horror was his specialty. Your whole, incomprehensible universe rendering mortal minds helpless thing. He wrote stories about that for fun. Want to see? Before HFY could respond, Elena activated another display. The operative who had initially probed her mind made a strangled sound and collapsed as images of Cthulhu, Azathoth, and the color out of space flooded the shared neural link. The beautiful thing about human imagination, Elena said conversationally as chaos erupted around her, is that we've already thought of everything you might use to frighten us. And then we've thought of things so much worse that your actual psychological attacks feel like gentle bedtime stories. The remaining operatives were backing toward the exit, their certainty dissolving like sugar in acid rain. Elena followed them with her displays, showing them glimpses of human creativity unleashed, SCP Foundation entries, urban legends evolved through digital folklore, horror films that pushed boundaries of taste and sanity. "Please," Commander Vex'thara said, and Elena realized with fascination that she was witnessing something that had never occurred in Zephyrian conquest history. They were afraid. Elena watched Commander Vex'thara's retreat with the clinical interest of a researcher observing an unexpected variable in her experiment. The Zephyrian boarding party huddled near the lab entrance, their crystalline forms dulled to the color of ash, while their leader struggled to process the impossible, prey that had become predator. "You know what the really fascinating part is?" Elena said, settling back into her chair as if they were having tea instead of conducting interspecies psychological warfare. "I haven't even shown you the good stuff yet." He pulled up a new interface, this one connected directly to Earth's cultural archives. Terabytes of humanity's collected nightmares began streaming through the station's communication array, aimed straight at the Zephyrian fleet, hanging in orbit like crystalline death above Kepler 442b. "What are you doing?" Vex'thara's voice had lost its commanding harmonics, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like pleading. "Educational outreach," Elena replied, fingers dancing across controls with the practiced ease of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. "Your people understand fear as a tool, but you've never experienced it as culture. Time for a crash course in human creativity." The first wave hit the Zephyrian fleet as classic horror, Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, stories so fundamental to human culture that children learned them as cautionary tales. Elena watched the biometric readings from the enemy ships spike as creatures born from human imagination flooded alien neural networks, designed to process but never experience terror. "Piece of fiction," one of the operatives managed to rasp. "Imaginary constructs, they cannot harm us." "Tell that to your cardiovascular analogues," Elena observed, noting the chaotic readings from the fleet. "Besides, we're just getting started. That was the tutorial level." The second wave introduced contemporary horror. Stephen King's small-town nightmares, Clive Barker's investigations into the geography of suffering, Shirley Jackson's exploration of psychological dissolution. Each story crafted by human minds that had spent lifetimes perfecting the architecture of dread. Through the communication link, Elena could hear the Zephyrian fleet's disciplined formations dissolving into chaos. Ships began breaking formation, fleeing in random directions as their crews experienced something their species had never evolved to handle, being the recipients rather than the distributors of existential terror. "Stop," Vex'thara whispered, his exoskeleton now flickering between colors like a broken display. "We withdraw. We will not approach human space." "Oh, but we haven't reached the really interesting part yet," Elena said with the enthusiasm of an academic about to share her favorite research topic. "See, the stories I just transmitted, those are the refined, edited, published versions. Humans have also developed something called creepypasta." She initiated the third wave. Internet folklore evolved through collective digital unconscious. Stories that mutated and grew stronger through each retelling. Urban legends that adapted to modern fears, and collaborative nightmares that no single human mind could have conceived alone. The Backrooms, The Rake, Local 58, SCP-173, concepts so alien to ordered Zephyrian thinking that their psychological warfare technology couldn't parse them, could only experience them as pure, concentrated wrongness. "These aren't even stories," Elena explained as alarms began screaming from the orbiting fleet. "They're psychological viruses, fear memes that replicate and evolve. Humans created them accidentally while trying to scare each other for fun." Commander HFY collapsed, his crystalline form cracking under psychological pressure his species had never imagined possible. "Your species is insane." "That's the beautiful part," Elena said, pulling up her final display. Real-time footage from Earth showing humans voluntarily entering escape rooms designed to simulate kidnapping scenarios, paying to be chased through corn mazes by actors with chainsaws, and lining up for horror movie marathons. "We're not insane, we're just really, really good at being afraid." The fourth wave represented humanity's cutting edge, interactive horror, virtual reality terror, and augmented reality nightmares that blurred the lines between fiction and experience. Elena watched with professional satisfaction as the Zephyrian fleet began transmitting surrender codes, their psychological warfare systems completely overwhelmed by concepts they couldn't comprehend. "The thing about being apex predators," Elena said conversationally, "is that you never develop defenses against your own weapons. You've spent millennia perfecting fear as a tool, but you never learned to experience it as art." Through the neural link still connecting her to the boarding party, Elena felt something she had never expected: the approaching presence of Queen Vex'thara herself, the legendary architect of the Zephyrian Empire's expansion. The psychic signature was unmistakable, ancient, vast, and utterly confident in its ability to break any mind it encountered. "Your Majesty," Elena said aloud, though the Queen was still aboard her flagship. "How delightful. I was hoping we'd have a chance to chat." The response came not through spoken words, but as direct psychic pressure, the full weight of Zephyrian royal authority pressing against Elena's consciousness like a stellar mass object warping space-time. Most sentient beings exposed to Queen Vex'thara's direct attention simply ceased to function, their minds unable to process the sheer scope of her psychological presence. Elena felt the pressure, acknowledged it, and began laughing. "Oh, Your Majesty," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "You have no idea what you've just walked into, do you?" The Queen's presence intensified, flooding Elena's mind with visions of cosmic entropy, universal heat death, and the ultimate meaninglessness of existence itself. The psychic attack that had shattered galactic civilizations. Elena nodded appreciatively. "That's quite good. Very existential. But have you considered the implications of Roko's basilisk?" The Queen's presence flickered, confusion bleeding through absolute confidence for the first time in millennia. "No," Elena continued. "What about the concept that you might already be living in a simulation designed to torture you specifically? Or the possibility that every choice you make creates infinite alternate versions of yourself, most of whom are suffering unimaginably?" Queen Vex'thara's psychic assault faltered as Elena introduced her to philosophical horror, concepts that turned consciousness itself into a weapon against the self. "The wonderful thing about human imagination," Elena said as the Queen's mental presence began to retreat, "is that we've already imagined every possible way to suffer. And then we've imagined ways to suffer that don't even exist yet." She prepared to transmit the final wave, humanity's masterpiece collection of existential terror, collaborative nightmares and conceptual horrors that had evolved beyond mere fiction into something approaching weaponized philosophy. "Please," said a voice that had commanded fleets and broken star systems. "Please." Elena paused her transmission, fingers hovering over controls that could have continued humanity's psychological counterattack until the Zephyrian Empire collapsed into gibbering madness. The sudden silence in Lab 7 felt profound, broken only by the soft whimpering of Commander HFY and the distant alarms from ships that had once been instruments of conquest. Interesting word choice, Elena mused, studying the biometric chaos emanating from Queen Vex'thara's flagship. I don't believe "please" appears anywhere in your species' diplomatic vocabulary, at least not in any of the surrender documents I've catalogued. The Queen's response arrived not as psychic pressure, but as something far more dangerous to a being accustomed to absolute power: genuine vulnerability. We miscalculated. Your species defies our understanding of sentient psychology. That's the thing about being professional conquerors, Elena said, leaning back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone whose thesis had just been proven correct. You get really good at breaking things, but you never learn what happens when something refuses to break the way you expect. She pulled up a new interface, not another horror compilation, but a contract template that she'd been refining for months. Terms of surrender, reparation schedules, and behavioral modifications that would transform the Zephyrian Empire from galactic predators into something resembling productive citizens. Here's what's going to happen, Elena said, transmitting the document across subspace. Complete withdrawal from all occupied systems, full reparations to displaced populations, and most importantly, you're going to help me establish a new kind of diplomatic corps. Explain, Queen Vex'thara managed, her voice still trembling with aftershocks from exposure to humanity's philosophical horrors. Other species keep requesting military advisors to help them resist psychological warfare, Elena explained. Turns out what they actually need are humans trained in therapeutic applications of controlled terror, fear inoculation through graduated exposure to manageable fictional threats. The irony was delicious. Elena had spent her career being dismissed as the quiet academic who played with alien fairy tales, while her colleagues pursued more prestigious research. Now galactic civilizations were lining up to hire human consultants who could teach them humanity's greatest survival skill: learning to be afraid without being paralyzed by fear. You will teach other species to resist us? The Queen asked. Better than that, Elena said. I'm going to teach them to resist anyone who tries to weaponize their psychology. Humans aren't special because we're brave. We're special because we learned to transform terror into entertainment, which means we can transform any psychological attack into just another story we've already heard. Through the neural link, Elena felt something she hadn't expected: gratitude. Queen Vex'thara was experiencing relief that her conquest had been stopped before her empire committed itself to a war it could never win, against an opponent it could never understand. The terms are acceptable, the Queen transmitted, but I must ask, how long have you been planning this? Elena smiled, pulling up her personnel file. 3 years of requesting assignment to xenolinguistic research, months of volunteer work cataloguing irrelevant cultural transmissions, a career of being overlooked, underestimated, and relegated to harmless academic pursuits. Since the day I realized that every other species in the galaxy treats fear as a problem to be solved, she said. Humans treat it as a skill to be developed. That's not just a cultural difference, it's a strategic advantage that no one bothered to notice because we're too busy apologizing for being weird. Commander HFY finally managed to stand, his crystalline form still flickering with psychological damage. How do we know you won't use these weapons against us again? Because, Elena said, shutting down her horror archives and returning to her original work, translation matrices and linguistic analysis that everyone had assumed were harmless. I'm not interested in conquest. I'm interested in making sure that what you did to other species never happens again. She gestured toward her screens, where surrender documents from 7 different star systems were being automatically translated into standardized treaty language. The same boring, repetitive work that had made her invisible to her colleagues was now processing the end of a galactic empire. Besides, Elena added, humans prefer our horror fictional. Reality is disappointing by comparison. 6 months later, Elena sat in the same lab, in the same chair, doing the same work that had always made her colleagues dismiss her as unremarkable. The only difference was that her harmless linguistic research now included correspondence from 12 different species requesting human psychological warfare consultants, 3 universities offering her department chairs, and 1 very polite letter from Queen Vex'thara asking if humanity had any more philosophers they'd like to share. Elena deleted the job offers without reading them, filed the diplomatic correspondence in appropriate folders, and returned to her current project, analyzing communication patterns from a previously unknown species that seemed to have developed some fascinating approaches to mimetic warfare. Dr. Chen Nakamura passed her workstation, coffee bulb in hand, wearing the same expression he'd always worn when looking at her work. "Still playing with your alien fairy tales, Vasquez?" Elena didn't look up from her screens, where truly disturbing concepts were taking shape in elegant mathematical formulations that most people would assume was ceremonial nonsense. "Something like that," she said, fingers never pausing in their dance across the keyboard. After all, someone had to keep an eye on the galaxy's bedtime stories, and Elena had learned that the quiet ones were always the most dangerous.